Europe, 1944. In the churned mud of Normandy and the frozen fields of the Eastern Front, one name travels through Allied ranks like a whispered curse: Tiger. The mere sound of it carried weight, a symbol of German precision and the terrifying efficiency of their armored divisions. Its long 80 mm gun could slice through a Sherman at over 2 kilometers. Its thick armor shrugged off most Allied shells like rain on steel. To face one was to stare at the machine embodiment of the Reich's confidence. German propaganda fed the legend. Newsreels showed the Tiger prowling through smoke and ruin, its turret turning with cold deliberation, shells exploding harmlessly against its hull. To the soldiers who fought it, it seemed less like a machine and more like a myth, an indestructible beast of iron. Its presence alone could halt an Allied advance. It was the weapon Hitler himself believed could reverse the tide. But inside the myth was a quiet, dangerous flaw. For every Tiger that roared into battle, another sat motionless miles behind the front. Broken transmissions, seized engines, fuel pumps that refused to feed. Mechanics worked through the night in mud and snow, their hands raw and black with oil, trying to bring these giants back to life. The Tiger's power came at a cost: complexity. What made it formidable also made it fragile, and as the Allies learned to strike not the tank, but the system that sustained it, the myth began to crack. Supply lines faltered, spare parts vanished. A Tiger without fuel was just a coffin with a turret. By 1945, fields once dominated by German armor were littered with the hulks of machines that had never reached the enemy. The Tiger had not been slain by gunfire. It had been undone by its own perfection. Yet even as they burned, the legend endured. And in that legend lay the seed of Germany's next fatal illusion. To the Allied soldier crouched in the hedgerows of Normandy or staring across the plains of Kursk, the sight of a Tiger tank was enough to still the breath. Its silhouette, broad, angular, unhurried, seemed to carry the weight of inevitability. When its cannon flashed, men swore it was fate itself, delivered in steel. Yet what most never realized was how rarely that sight occurred. The Tiger's legend was built not on its numbers, but on its absence. For every Tiger that roared into combat, several more never reached the field. Their engines, overburdened by weight and design, tore themselves apart on rough roads. Their transmissions failed in the first kilometers. Even before a single shot was fired, mechanical attrition had already claimed half the force. The Tiger's greatest strength, its power, was chained to its greatest flaw: fragility. On paper, the German armored divisions were unmatched. In reality, they were ghosts, listed on reports, absent on battlefields. Supply convoys ran dry, cut apart by Allied air power. Fuel that once flowed from Romania's oil fields now vanished into the fires of retreat. Without it, even the mightiest tank became a monument to futility. Crews would strip vital parts, torch their machines, and march away in silence. By 1944, photographs of destroyed German armor told a misleading story. Many of those hulks had never seen an enemy tank. They were undone by heat, mud, and neglect, victims of complexity fighting a war that demanded simplicity. Still, the illusion endured. Every Allied soldier who met a functioning Tiger carried that terror into retelling, and every retelling magnified the myth. Fear multiplied faster than facts. And so, as Germany's armies retreated, the image of unstoppable power remained, even as its engines fell silent in the mud. But far from the front, deep in the Reich's factories, engineers were already chasing an even greater illusion, one they believed could restore what the Tiger had lost. To those who watched from the ridgelines, to the soldiers, to the photographers, to the world, tank battles seemed like contests of might. Giant against giant, steel grinding against steel, victory measured in the wrecks that burned across open fields. But beneath that spectacle lay another war, quieter, relentless, and unseen. A war fought not between tanks, but within them. Every armored vehicle was a collection of thousands of parts, pistons, bearings, valves, pumps, each dependent on the others, each capable of betrayal. A tank was not a weapon so much as a fragile ecosystem of metal and motion. The Germans understood this better than anyone. They sought perfection in every bolt, harmony in every mechanism, and in that pursuit of flawless engineering, they created machines too beautiful to survive a dirty war. The Tiger, the Panther, even the smaller Panzer IV, each bore the signature of an engineer's pride. Tolerances measured to fractions of millimeters, gears polished to brilliance, tracks designed for precision, not punishment. They were masterpieces of form, but in the mud of Russia or the dust of Normandy, perfection turned to poison. Engines seized when dust clogged their filters, suspension systems shattered under frozen ground, transmissions demanded oil grades that no longer existed. Meanwhile, the Allies built differently. Their tanks were ugly, blunt, and brutal. A Sherman could be repaired with a wrench and a hammer. A T-34 could run after losing half its road wheels. Germany's machines required craftsmen. The Allies' machines required soldiers. The contrast revealed a truth the Reich refused to see. Beauty is not strength, and precision is not endurance. The Tiger's armor could resist any shell, but it could not resist time. Each battle it survived brought it closer to mechanical death. In the end, the decisive struggle was not at the front lines, but in the maintenance depots, where exhausted crews waited for parts that would never arrive. Germany did not lose its tanks in battle. It lost them in the workshop, victims of their own ambition. And yet, in the twilight of defeat, the engineers did not stop. Deep inside shattered factories, they began drawing the next machine, one meant to correct every flaw, and in doing so, repeat every mistake. From the beginning, the Third Reich believed that technology was not merely a tool, it was destiny. Hitler's Germany saw machines as the physical proof of racial genius, the embodiment of what he called the triumph of will through steel. To his followers, the roar of an engine was not just sound, but ideology. The tank became more than a weapon. It became the mechanical soul of the Reich. In the 1930s, this belief appeared unshakable. German factories, silent for years after Versailles, were reborn under banners of innovation. The first panzer divisions rolled across Europe like manifestations of a new industrial god. The Panzer I and II were thinly armored and lightly armed, yet they achieved what the massive armies of the First World War could not: speed, precision, and terror. To Hitler, this was proof that German ingenuity could conquer limits themselves. But success became addiction. Each victory reinforced a dangerous faith that complexity equaled superiority, and that superiority guaranteed victory. Engineers were no longer solving problems, they were creating monuments. When the Panzer III gave way to the Panzer IV, and then to the Tiger and the Panther, each new design carried the same promise: redemption through perfection. Yet each also carried the same flaw: an obsession with what could be built, not what should be. The generals in the field understood the cost. They needed reliability, not reverence. Heinz Guderian, father of Germany's armored warfare, once pleaded for simplicity, for more tanks, not bigger ones. But in the Führer's headquarters, numbers were dismissed as cowardice. Hitler wanted miracles. He saw no virtue in enough. What mattered was Odyor. And so, German industry strained under impossible orders. Factories built weapons of prestige, not practicality, tanks that consumed twice the fuel, guns that required metals Germany could no longer spare, and vehicles that took months to assemble while the front collapsed in days. Every hour spent refining a Tiger II was an hour lost building the machines that could still turn wheels in the mud. In this faith lay a moral blindness. The Reich's engineers built as if war were a test of art, not endurance. They chased perfection while the world around them disintegrated. The Allies, by contrast, built what worked, crude, replaceable, relentless. Theirs was not a faith in beauty, but in function. By 1944, Germany's tanks stood as paradoxes of brilliance and futility, magnificent to behold, catastrophic to maintain. The Reich had fused ideology with engineering, and in doing so, built its own downfall. But as defeat loomed, the conviction remained unbroken. Deep in mountain factories and underground halls, a final generation of engineers still believed salvation could be drawn on a blueprint, a machine so advanced it could reverse the war itself. What they built next would test not just the limits of metal, but of faith itself. In the summer of 1941, as German panzers rolled deep into the Soviet Union, their confidence met an unexpected wall of steel. The Red Army's new T-34 tank appeared suddenly, almost ghost-like, on the eastern plains, fast, sloped, and terrifyingly efficient. Its armor deflected the German 37mm shells that once tore through everything. Its wide tracks floated over mud where German machines sank. For the first time, Hitler's armies saw an enemy weapon that was simply better. The encounter struck the German high command like a revelation. The myth of technical superiority had been broken in a single campaign. In panic and pride, new orders flashed through the Reich. Build a tank that would never again be outmatched. Out of that command came two names that would define the rest of the war: Tiger and Panther. The Tiger I was conceived as the ultimate breakthrough weapon. Its 88mm gun could destroy a T-34 or a Sherman before they ever entered range. Its armor was nearly impenetrable, its profile a fortress on tracks. The Panther, designed in parallel, was meant to blend mobility with lethality, a direct answer to the Soviet design it sought to surpass. On the drafting tables of Henschel and Mann, both machines looked like salvation, but the blueprints hid a fatal truth. They were too ambitious for the reality of war. The Tiger's gearbox survived barely 500 kilometers before collapsing under its own torque. Its engine, massive and temperamental, overheated on long marches. A single track repair could take hours, even under fire. The Panther, rushed into production for the Battle of Kursk, proved even more fragile. Of the 200 that arrived for the offensive, more than half were lost, not to Soviet guns, but to engine fires, leaking fuel, and fractured suspensions. And yet, to the men who fought beside them, these machines inspired both awe and despair. Soldiers worshipped them as symbols of power, but cursed the hours spent nursing them through the mud. A functioning Tiger could command a battlefield. A broken one could doom a retreat. Behind the front, factories groaned under their burden. Each Tiger required 300,000 man-hours to build, the labor of an entire factory for a single tank. In the time it took to make one, the Soviets could build 10 T-34s. What Germany saw as precision, the war revealed as waste. The Tiger and the Panther were not born from strategy, but from pride. Weapons too beautifully built to survive the ugliness of war. They dazzled the eye, shattered the enemy, and exhausted the nation that built them. Still, Berlin believed salvation lay just one design further ahead. One machine that could perfect what the Tiger and Panther could not. In hidden workshops, draftsmen began sketching the silhouette of Germany's final gamble. a tank so vast it would defy reason itself. Each German tank was a masterpiece and a mistake. Everyone was hand-built by craftsmen, assembled like a luxury car rather than a tool of war. The welds were immaculate, the tolerances exacting, the components tuned to individual machines. No two Tigers were ever quite the same. To the engineers, this was pride. To the soldiers, it was a curse. In the field, the illusion of standardization collapsed. A gearbox from one Tiger would not fit another. Bolts mismatched by a fraction of a millimeter could seize an entire engine. Even spare tracks varied slightly in width. What should have been routine repairs became acts of surgery, performed in freezing mud with tools unfit for the precision the machines demanded. Each tank became its own unique creature, magnificent but temperamental, and alone. The numbers told their own quiet tragedy. For every 100 hours a Tiger spent moving, it required 300 of maintenance. Crews became mechanics first, warriors second. Fuel leaks, broken suspension arms, clogged filters, these were not exceptions but constants. The machine that embodied German pride demanded endless devotion, and in war, devotion is death measured in time. Meanwhile, across the lines, the Allies pursued a different creed. Their tanks were crude, interchangeable, and relentless. A Sherman built in Detroit could share parts with one from Birmingham or Montreal. When it broke, another was waiting. Crews carried spare track links on the hull, fixing them with hammers, not micrometers. It was not art, but it worked. Germany had built a fleet it could not sustain. A force of exquisite machines trapped in the logic of peace, fighting a war that rewarded the ugly and the simple. The myth of quality devoured the reality of quantity. Perfection consumed production, and precision strangled progress. The Reich's factories could no longer keep up. By 1944, Allied bombers shattered assembly lines faster than new tanks could be completed. Mechanics scavenged wrecks for parts, cannibalizing one Tiger to save another. But even this became futile. There were not enough spares, not enough oil, not enough hands left to care for the beasts. The very detail that once defined German engineering now defined its downfall. In the end, the war had exposed a cruel paradox. The better the tank, the fewer that could fight. And as Germany's front lines stretched thin, perfection became a luxury no nation could afford. Still, in the quiet rooms of design offices, the engineers refused to yield. They believed one final leap, one design even greater than the Tiger, could restore what had been lost, but the machine they were about to build would not save Germany. It would become the final monument to its delusion. By 1944, the front lines of the war had shifted, not just on maps, but in meaning. The true battlefield was no longer marked by trenches or tank formations. It stretched across thousands of kilometers of roads, railways, and fuel lines. Victory belonged not to the side with the most tanks, but to the one that could keep them moving. Every Tiger tank consumed nearly 500 liters of fuel a day, more than a small convoy trucked across the Reich. In the early years, that seemed sustainable. Oil flowed from Romania, synthetic plants in Silesia churned night and day, and the engines of Blitzkrieg roared without restraint. But as the war dragged on, the sound of those engines faded. The Allies had learned where Germany's heart beat, and they set out to stop it. American bombers struck refineries and rail junctions with mechanical regularity. Soviet raiding parties tore up tracks, seized depots, and ambushed convoys far behind the front. The Luftwaffe, once guardian of German mobility, could no longer protect its own lifelines. Trains carrying vital supplies vanished in fire and smoke. Even the mighty Tiger became useless without a single tanker to feed it. Fuel shortages reshaped the rhythm of war. Armored divisions that once advanced by the day now moved by the week. Every operation was measured not in kilometers, but in liters. Crews rationed movement, idling engines only to keep batteries alive. Some units towed their own tanks with others. When the last reserves ran dry, commanders gave an unthinkable order: abandon the machines. In diary after diary, soldiers wrote of the same despair. "We fight on wheels of air," one mechanic recorded. Another wrote, "The tank is perfect. The world around it is broken." They fought not against the enemy, but against mathematics, the slow, suffocating arithmetic of attrition. To keep a few tanks running, others were sacrificed. In the forests of Poland and the ruins of France, mechanics turned battlefields into workshops, stripping damaged Tigers for parts. Engines were hoisted from burned hulls. Transmissions were pulled apart under shellfire. The carcasses of once proud machines became donors for those still able to crawl forward. It was a grim equation. One tank dying so another might live a little longer. Even the smaller Panthers and Panzer IVs could not escape the crisis. Germany's railway network, once a marvel of efficiency, buckled under bombing and retreat. Bridges collapsed, locomotives were lost, and routes vanished into occupied territory. Fuel shipments from the last Romanian wells arrived weeks late, sometimes never. In desperation, engineers experimented with coal gasifiers, converting tanks to burn wood instead of oil. It was an act of futility, a symbol of a nation consuming itself. While Germany struggled to move one Tiger across Europe, the Allies moved entire armies. American trucks, the Red Ball Express, carried thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food daily. The Soviets repaired rails faster than the Germans could destroy them, feeding an advance that devoured distance. The Western Allies had turned logistics into an art of repetition. The Germans, once masters of speed, were now prisoners of stillness. What had begun as a war of machines had become a war of movement, and Germany had forgotten the difference. It had built tanks too powerful for its own economy to sustain. Every liter of fuel spent on a Tiger meant less for trucks, less for planes, less for the men who still believed in victory. The strength that once defined the Wehrmacht now consumed it from within. By the last winter, even retreat became impossible. Entire battalions sat stranded, their engines cold, their guns silent. The Tiger's shadow, once the terror of Europe, now lay motionless under falling snow. In the end, the war was not lost by courage or design, but by distance. Germany's tanks did not die in combat. They died of thirst, of hunger, of exhaustion. But as the last drops of fuel burned away, one final design was being tested, a machine so vast and so improbable that it defied the reality of defeat itself. A weapon born not from need, but from denial. By 1943, the war for Germany's tanks was no longer fought in the mud, but in the air. Allied bombers crossed the skies in endless waves, not to strike armies, but to cripple the hands that built them. The new front line was industrial, a map of factories, foundries, and rail yards. Cities like Kassel, Nuremberg, and Linz became targets not for what they defended, but for what they produced. The men and women who once forged the engines of conquest now labored under siege. Production halls that had once hummed with precision now echoed with alarms and falling debris. The roar of bombers replaced the rhythm of machinery. Every explosion tore not just concrete and steel, but the fragile chain of competence that held German industry together. The loss of skilled labor deepened the wound. As the front consumed men, the Reich drafted its best machinists and engineers into the army. Their places were filled by forced laborers, prisoners, foreigners, and civilians dragged from conquered lands. They worked under whips, hunger, and fear, assembling weapons they neither understood nor believed in. The result was inevitable. Perfection gave way to improvisation, craftsmanship to exhaustion. Quality control became a casualty long before the war ended. Engines failed straight from the assembly line. Gearboxes jammed before tanks left the rail yards. Welds cracked on armor plates that once gleamed with pride. Some Panthers arrived at the front already broken, their crews forced to repair them before their first battle. The elegant machines that had once symbolized German superiority now carried within them the fatigue of a dying system. The statistics told a story few in Berlin dared to speak aloud. Of the 6,000 Panthers built during the war, less than half ever reached combat. The rest were lost in transport, destroyed in factories, or abandoned during retreat. Germany's production lines had become graveyards of unfinished machines, monuments to ambition, undone by attrition. Even as the bombs fell, Hitler demanded more. In his speeches, he spoke of miracle weapons, tanks and guns that would turn the tide. Engineers obeyed, designing larger engines, thicker armor, and heavier guns. But for every new innovation, the foundations beneath them eroded further. Rail lines shattered, power grids flickered, steel shipments never arrived. The very brilliance of Germany's designs became a burden its crumbling factories could no longer bear. The irony was merciless. The more advanced the weapon, the more fragile the system required to sustain it. The Tiger II, the most formidable tank of its age, demanded an industrial network as precise as its own machinery, a network that no longer existed. Each unit built in defiance of collapse was less a tool of war and more an act of denial. By 1944, the once proud industrial heart of Germany beat faintly beneath layers of dust and ruin. Workers toiled in darkness as power failed, assembling tanks by candlelight in bomb-damaged halls. The smoke of burning cities mixed with the metallic scent of unfinished steel. The Reich, which had promised victory through engineering, was now devoured by the very complexity it worshipped. The factory front was Germany's final, invisible battlefield, a place where no soldier could fight and no victory could be won. Each new bombing raid erased weeks of labor, each destroyed rail yard severed another artery of the war machine. And as the Allies advanced toward the heart of the Reich, one final vision still gripped Hitler's mind, a weapon so massive, so invulnerable, that it could restore the illusion of control. In secret workshops, the blueprints were already complete. The machine would be called Maus. In war, not every enemy wears a uniform. Some arrive without warning, silent, patient, and absolute. For Germany's armored legions, that enemy was the earth itself. Russian mud, Arctic winters, desert heat, nature turned against the Reich with the same precision its engineers once believed only they could command. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, its tanks rolled east with mathematical confidence. Every track, every gear, every engine had been designed for the paved roads and temperate fields of Europe. But beyond the forests of Poland, the ground changed. Roads dissolved into swamps, rivers overflowed. The German timetable met a landscape that refused to cooperate. What was planned as a campaign of weeks began to drown, hour by hour, in the Russian mud. The autumn Rasputitsa, the season of melting and mud, swallowed everything. Panthers and panzers sank to their hulls, engines screaming as tracks spun uselessly. Supply convoys bogged down until the lines behind them collapsed. In desperation, soldiers lashed logs beneath their tanks to gain traction, but even this failed. "Our greatest enemy is terrain," one panzer commander wrote. "We fight the earth more than the Red Army." Then came winter. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Steel became brittle, oil froze solid in its drums, and engines cracked before they could even start. Tanks were lit with open fires beneath their hulls just to coax the metal back to life. Gun breeches shattered when fired. The same machines that had conquered France now stood paralyzed, entombed by a climate that showed no mercy. The Soviets, born to that landscape, had prepared for it. Their T-34s glided through mud and snow with wide tracks and simple engines. Where German tanks froze, Soviet crews rolled on, unbothered by the cold. Their machines were not beautiful, but they worked. Each hour that nature punished the invaders, the Red Army grew stronger. Far to the south, in the deserts of North Africa, a different kind of enemy awaited. Sandstorms scoured paint from armor. Fine dust infiltrated every gear and bearing. German tanks, built with narrow tolerances, seized under the friction. Air filters clogged, cooling systems failed. In contrast, British and American tanks, coarser in design, endured. They were not spared by skill, but by simplicity. Across every front, the pattern repeated. The Tiger's engine overheated in Tunisia. The Panther's gearbox froze outside Leningrad. Even the vaunted Tiger II, the King Tiger, cracked its own armor under extreme cold, not from impact, but from contraction. The elements had no ideology, yet they chose their side with ruthless consistency. German engineers had designed for control, for a world that obeyed blueprints and calculations. But nature could not be engineered. Perfection, when tested by chaos, became weakness. Each storm, each flood, each frozen dawn revealed the same truth. Technology built for precision cannot bend, and what cannot bend will break. As the war turned against Germany, the weather seemed almost to mock its machines. Tanks lay half buried in snowdrifts, their engines cold, their silhouettes sharp against the white horizon. They were monuments to a kind of arrogance, the belief that human intellect could master the earth itself. By 1944, the Reich's armies no longer feared the Red Army alone. They feared the ground beneath their tracks, the sky above their heads, and the seasons they could not escape. In the end, the greatest test of engineering was not battle, but endurance. And endurance belonged to those who built for imperfection. But as nature conquered the machines of war, another battle was being waged in the shadows, one not of weather or mud, but of fuel, ambition, and desperation. A final effort to build the unstoppable weapon before time and the world ran out. June 1944. The fields of Normandy awaken beneath thunder. The greatest armada in history has crossed the Channel, and with it comes a new kind of war. For the German tank divisions waiting inland, this is the test they were built for. The Tiger and the Panther, symbols of the Reich's mechanical supremacy, prepare to meet the enemy once more. Yet beneath their steel confidence lies an unspoken truth. The world around them has already changed. When the first reports of the Allied landings reach German headquarters, armored battalions begin their march toward the beaches. But progress is agony. Bridges lie in ruins from days of bombing. Rail lines are shattered, roads choked with wreckage. Each kilometer forward costs another engine, another tank abandoned in a ditch. What once would have been a swift and precise deployment becomes a slow-motion retreat toward inevitability. Those tigers and panthers that do reach the front still inspire terror. In open duels, they remain nearly invincible. A single Tiger the Björns, dug in near Villers-Bocage, halts an entire British column, destroying 25 vehicles in less than 15 minutes. On the bocage-lined roads of France, Allied crews speak of the beasts in the hedgerows, invisible, patient, and deadly. When they fire, men vanish inside their burning armor before they can even return a shot. But there are too few, and for every tank that strikes, another never arrives. The Reich's armored divisions have become scattered fragments of what they once were. Each air raid on a railway yard kills a dozen machines before they ever reach combat. A single bomb dropped on a bridge can delay an entire division for days. The Germans can still win battles, but not the war that feeds them. And then, from the sky, comes the new predator, Allied aircraft. Once vulnerable to flak and fighters, now roam with near impunity. Rocket-armed typhoons and thunderbolts turn the battlefield into a hunting ground. A tiger's armor, thick enough to resist any cannon, means nothing to a rocket strike from above. Tanks that once ruled the land now hide beneath trees, their crews listening for the whistle of approaching aircraft. "We are being slaughtered like animals," one German commander writes. "The sky is no longer ours." The change is not tactical, it is evolutionary. The battlefield has outgrown the machines that were meant to master it. What once symbolized progress now represents inertia, an empire of steel too heavy to keep pace with a war that moves by air, by speed, by supply. Every destroyed panther, every stranded tiger, is more than a loss of machinery. It is the death of an idea, that power lies in perfection rather than adaptation. By late summer, the illusion of indestructibility is gone. Normandy becomes a graveyard of tanks, some burned, others abandoned, their crews having fled or surrendered. The once revered silhouettes of the tiger and panther now lie twisted in ditches, their turrets pointing skyward like questions without answers. Even as they burn, they are beautiful, but beauty no longer matters. Against the endless tide of men, machines, and air power, precision gives way to persistence. The war has entered an age the tiger was never built to survive. In the skies above Normandy, evolution itself has taken command. And deep in Germany, as reports of destruction reach the factories, a new delusion takes hold, that perhaps a weapon even larger, even heavier, could turn back time itself. The idea is madness, but in the ruins of the Reich, madness is all that remains. By the autumn of 1944, the armored heart of the Reich was dying on its feet. Across the plains of France, through the forests of Poland, the once proud divisions that had crushed Europe now limped eastward in retreat. Their engines coughed black smoke, their fuel tanks dry, their roads littered with corpses of steel. What had begun as blitzkrieg had become a pilgrimage of ruin, a mechanical death march toward oblivion. For the men inside those machines, the war no longer resembled strategy. It had become maintenance. Every kilometer gained meant another breakdown, another tank stranded. Supply lines that once carried triumph now carried desperation, or nothing at all. When fuel convoys failed to arrive, tank crews siphoned from wrecks, mixed aviation fuel with diesel, even drained civilian cars. Nothing worked for long. As the Allied armies pressed forward, the German tank became a paradox, too strong to destroy easily, yet too fragile to survive. Crews abandoned their vehicles not from fear, but from futility. Panthers and tigers, once the envy of the world, were left behind in ditches, their great hulls scuttled by explosives placed by their own hands. Flames rose over the fields, columns of smoke marking the retreat of an army that had once advanced like clockwork. Still, official reports described these losses as temporary. Propaganda continued to speak of unbreakable machines and invincible armor. But in the mud of retreat, soldiers knew the truth. They no longer fought for victory, only for movement. One more day, one more road, one more engine that would start. Commanders issued orders that reality could no longer obey. Fuel allocations were written for tanks that no longer existed. Reinforcements were promised from factories already reduced to ash. By now, perfection had become a burden. The tiger's great weight, its very symbol of strength, chained it to the earth. Bridges collapsed under its mass. Roads crumbled behind it. To move a single tank often required the sacrifice of several trucks' worth of fuel, resources the Reich no longer possessed. "We cannot move our gods," one officer said, standing beside a line of motionless tigers. "They are too heavy for this world." The crews faced a quiet horror. For years they had worshipped their machines, polishing them, protecting them, believing in their power. Now they were forced to destroy them. Each detonation felt like an execution. In their eyes, the tank was not just a weapon, but a companion, the last thing between them and the abyss. To light the fuse and walk away was to abandon the last symbol of control in a collapsing world. As winter came, the retreat turned from defeat into disintegration. Fuel drums were emptied, engines left to freeze. Tank crews joined the infantry, fighting with rifles, walking through snow beside the wrecks of their former power. What had once been the cutting edge of technology now lay silent across Europe, a graveyard of burned-out hulls stretching from Normandy to the Vistula. Yet the orders continued, senseless, absolute, unyielding. "Hold your ground. Counterattack. Do not abandon your tanks." These commands, written in offices hundreds of miles away, arrived like echoes from another world. The men obeyed when they could, disobeyed when they must, and learned that obedience no longer meant survival. The myth of the machine, the faith that steel could replace strategy, that design could outlast destiny, was dying beside them. What had begun as worship ended in disbelief. The tank, once the heart of Germany's identity, had become its coffin. And still, deep within Germany, the engineers worked. Even as the front collapsed and the armies burned their own creations, blueprints continued to emerge from drawing boards. They believed one final miracle of design could still redeem the ruin. But what they were building now was no longer a weapon. It was a tomb. The Maus, a tank so vast that even if completed, it would never have moved at all. By the dawn of 1945, Germany's armored legions were ghosts, hollow echoes of the iron armies that had once thundered across Europe. What remained of the panzer divisions no longer maneuvered. They simply endured. In the east, the last panthers dug into the frozen ground of the Vistula and the Oder, their engines long silent. They fired from fixed positions, immobile bunkers of steel, monuments to a mobility that no longer existed. Around them, the world they had been built to dominate was moving on without them. Soviet T-34s, crude but tireless, poured westward in waves. American Shermans rolled over the Rhine in endless columns, their engines humming, their supply lines full. These were not superior machines, but they were alive. Germany's tanks, masterpieces of precision, had become fossils of a vanished age. Inside Hitler's bunker, however, the dream persisted. Surrounded by reports of lost divisions and burning cities, he spoke still of miracle weapons, new tanks, new guns, new engines, salvation through steel. The names alone betrayed the delusion. Maus, E-100, Löwe, beasts of myth, not war. The Maus, a 188-ton Leviathan, would have been too heavy for any bridge in Europe. The E-100, designed to rival it, existed only in sketches and scattered components. Yet the engineers kept working. In underground chambers and bomb-scarred halls, they drew blueprints while artillery thundered overhead. For them, obedience was all that remained. Many had begun this journey with conviction, believing that the future of Germany lay in the marriage of intellect and machinery. Now they built because not building meant death. Each line on the paper was an act of denial, a way to believe that perfection could still save them from collapse. But perfection no longer mattered. The war had reduced even the finest machines to scavenged steel. Spare parts no longer arrived. Factories stood roofless, their walls open to the sky. Workers soldered under candlelight, assembling fragments for tanks that would never see combat. The same nation that once glorified the rhythm of industry now lived among its ruins. On the battlefield, the last tanks died without ceremony. Outnumbered, outflanked, they fired until they jammed, then burned. The Soviet advance swept past them like a tide against statues. Some crews stayed inside their Panthers as they exploded, unwilling to abandon the machines that had become their identity. Others walked to east, west, or simply nowhere, men untethered from the myth they had served. In the end, Germany's war of machines collapsed not through lack of genius, but through its excess. Every improvement demanded a cost the nation could no longer pay. The Tiger II, the pinnacle of armor, devoured resources enough for 10 simpler tanks. The Maus, the final expression of that obsession, never moved an inch. It was a tank built for an empire that no longer existed, an emperor's dream entombed in steel. When Soviet troops entered the proving grounds at Kummersdorf, they found the prototype still standing, mute, immense, and absurd. Nearby, stacks of unfinished blueprints waited for machines that would never be born. The Reich's dream of mechanical supremacy had ended not in victory, but in paperwork. The myth of power, the faith that technology could conquer history, had collapsed under the weight of its own perfection. The weapons meant to guarantee eternity had hastened extinction. The tank, once Germany's symbol of destiny, now lay rusting in the mud of surrender. In the quiet after the guns, the engineers walked among their ruins. They saw the machines they had built, and what they had built them for. Beauty had become burden, strength had become stillness, and the pursuit of perfection had led only here. And so ended the iron ideal, not in battle, but in silence. A dream that began with motion, finished unable to move at all. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the victors began to count. Not the dead, not yet, but the machines. Across Europe, fields and roads were littered with the carcasses of steel. Turrets lay overturned, tracks twisted, hulls burned to rust. For 6 years, the war had been a contest of engineering. Now it could finally be measured. Germany had built 46,000 tanks and assault guns, an arsenal of intricacy and ambition. Each one represented the labor of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men. But on the other side of that arithmetic stood something the Reich had never understood: scale. The Allies had built over 200,000. For every Tiger that emerged from a German factory, 5 Shermans or 10 T-34s waited somewhere beyond the horizon. Precision had been defeated by multiplication. The difference was not only in numbers, but in philosophy. The German tank was a masterpiece, but it was also a bottleneck, a machine so refined that its production could never outpace destruction. Each new model demanded new parts, new tools, new training. The Allies, by contrast, believed in sameness. A Sherman built in Detroit could be repaired with a wrench from Cairo or Calcutta. A T-34 knocked together in the Urals could share parts with one from Stalingrad. They were ugly, crude, and eternal. When post-war analysts examined the figures, the pattern became painfully clear. The Tiger, which dominated headlines, never numbered more than 1,300 in total. The Panther, feared for its balance of speed and firepower, reached only 6,000 before the factories fell. The T-34 surpassed 50,000. The Sherman, over 49,000. The war of machines had become a war of mathematics, and Germany's equations had never balanced. On the battlefield, this imbalance expressed itself not as strategy, but as inevitability. A Tiger could destroy 5 Shermans in a single engagement, and still lose, because the sixth would arrive before nightfall. A panther might hold a crossroads for hours, but when its engine failed or its crew ran out of fuel, replacements would not come. For Germany, every victory was subtraction in disguise. Behind the numbers lay a moral reckoning. The German faith in superiority, in the idea that mastery of detail could triumph over mass, had turned from strength to weakness. Complexity kills in chaos. The very things that made their machines exceptional made them impossible to sustain. A system that worshipped perfection had forgotten the virtue of sufficiency. When the Allies surveyed the wreckage, they found beauty amid failure. Tigers and panthers were studied, measured, admired, and quietly dismissed. Their influence lived on, not in imitation, but in caution. The next generation of tanks would borrow their lessons, not their arrogance. Simplicity, mobility, and quantity would become the new trinity of warfare. For the German engineers who survived, the reckoning was personal. In post-war interrogations, many spoke not of defeat, but of disbelief, that such artistry could lose to repetition. One designer described it as a mathematical tragedy. Another, more simply, we built too well. In the end, the story of the Tiger and its kin was not about design, but about proportion, the balance between what can be built and what can be born. A machine can be perfect, but if it cannot be replaced, it dies alone. The myth of superiority had been undone by subtraction, by the slow, relentless erosion of numbers that no amount of genius could overcome. And yet, even as the Reich vanished into rubble, the myth itself did not die. Somewhere in the ruins, a new belief was already forming, that technology, reborn and refined, could cleanse the sins of its past. When the war ended, the tanks that had once shaken continents fell silent. Their carcasses lay scattered across Europe, in forests, in fields, beside rivers whose names few remembered. Most were scrapped, melted down, or buried where they broke. But one machine refused to die. The Tiger tank, symbol of fear, of power, of perfection, was reborn not on the battlefield, but in memory. In the years that followed 1945, the Tiger became legend. It appeared in museums as a relic of awe, in films as a mechanical monster, in stories as the invincible beast of a fallen empire. Veterans on both sides spoke of it in tones of reverence and dread. To Allied crews, it was the adversary that haunted their youth, the unstoppable shadow behind every hedgerow. To the Germans who had served in them, it was pride and regret made of steel, the weapon that had once given them hope and then abandoned them in fire. The myth grew easily because it suited everyone. To the Allies, the Tiger justified the losses. If their victories had come at such cost, surely the enemy's weapons had been superhuman. To Germany, it offered a cleaner kind of remembrance, one built on engineering brilliance rather than ideology. The Tiger became a monument to skill, detached from the cause it served. It was easier to remember genius than guilt. Cinema carried the legend further. Films of the 1950s and 60s painted the Tiger as an indestructible predator, its turret turning with patient menace. War memoirs spoke of lone tigers halting entire battalions, of shells bouncing off their armor, like rain. Even when untrue, the exaggerations found believers. Fear had outlived fact. Model kits, documentaries, and video games followed. The Tiger became collectible mythology, a brand of war. Its shape, its sound, even its name evoked a cold majesty. School children who could not name the battles of the Eastern Front could still identify a Tiger by sight. Few knew that most of those machines had never fired a shot in anger, or that the majority were abandoned by their own crews. When historians began to open the archives, a different picture emerged. Maintenance logs, not propaganda. told the truth. Tigers spent more time in repair depots than in battle. Gearboxes failed after a few days, engines overheated, transmissions burned out, road wheels cracked from strain. Of the roughly 1,300 Tigers built, most were lost not to enemy fire, but to distance, weather, and neglect. The beast of legend had often died before it ever reached the fight. And yet, the myth persisted, because myths serve emotion, not evidence. The tiger embodied something larger than itself, the human desire to believe that mastery of form can conquer the chaos of war. Its failure was forgotten because its image was too perfect to discard. The legend was easier to love than the truth. In truth, the tiger's story was never about strength, but fragility, the cost of believing that perfection can exist in destruction. It was a machine of precision trapped in a world of mud and entropy. The steel that made it powerful also made it heavy. The skill that made it unique made it unsustainable. But those lessons rusted away as memory polished the myth. Today, the surviving tigers sit silent in museums, their paint restored, their engines rebuilt for exhibition. Visitors gaze at them in reverence, mistaking survival for triumph. But beneath the surface, the old fractures remain. The welds that cracked, the bearings that seized, the elegance that destroyed itself. History's memory, like steel, rusts selectively. We remember what glitters, not what grinds. And so the tiger lives on, not as the machine it was, but as the ghost we prefer it to be. Yet beneath that ghost, another question lingers. If a myth can outlive its failure, what else from that war has survived not because it was true, but because it was beautiful? The truth behind Germany's tanks is not one of defeat, but of revelation. The wrecks that still lie rusting across Europe are not merely relics of battle. They are monuments to a fatal idea. The belief that power could replace balance, that beauty could stand in for endurance, that perfection itself could win a war. The tiger did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was magnificent. Every rivet, every weld, every curve of its armor reflected a nation's conviction that mastery of design was mastery of destiny. But war is not a test of elegance. It is a test of endurance. The tiger was a masterpiece of engineering and a catastrophe of purpose, a symbol of brilliance shackled by its own ambition. In its shadow lies the central paradox of the Third Reich, a civilization that built with genius and destroyed with arrogance. Germany's tanks were born from obsession. They were designed to be flawless, and in doing so, became unsustainable. The pursuit of mechanical purity consumed the resources that might have preserved survival. Every tiger rolled off the assembly line as a victory for craftsmanship and a defeat for common sense. Each demanded care that no army under siege could afford. Each embodied an illusion that no empire could sustain. In contrast, the Allies built without pride. Their machines were crude, but alive. The T-34 and the Sherman were not beautiful. They were possible. They could be repaired in mud, fueled from barrels, driven by men who had never seen a factory. Where Germany sought perfection, the Allies sought persistence. And persistence, in the end, is the truest form of strength. The tiger's legacy is not one of glory, but of warning. It teaches that the line between genius and hubris is drawn not in design, but in consequence. For all its power, it could not bend to the realities of war. Its armor was invincible to shells, but brittle to time, to weather, to mathematics. It was the weapon that could win battles, but not wars. There is something deeply human in its failure, the same flaw that drives civilizations to overreach and inventors to believe they can outwit the limits of reality. The tiger's story is the story of brilliance undone by pride, of power blinded by belief. It is a reminder that every empire that worships its machines eventually becomes servant to them. When the last tiger fell silent, the echo it left was not triumph, but understanding. Simplicity is genius. Humility is strength. Perfection, when mistaken for purpose, becomes destruction. The tiger's roar still carries across history, not as the sound of victory, but as a warning whispered through steel and smoke. In the quiet after the war, historians would write of design, of tactics, of numbers. But the real lesson lies elsewhere, in the humility of what endures. The machines that symbolized supremacy became their own executioners. They built the greatest tanks in history and proved forever that greatness without endurance is nothing at all.